Hello, my name is Andrew Margenot. I'm a soil scientist and a assistant professor in the Department of Crop Sciences here at the U of I. Today I'm going to share with you some of our lab's results on a promising candidate slow-release phosphorus fertilizer known as Struvite. This is the result of a 4-year project, now in its final year, that is supported by the Illinois NREC, Nutrient Research and Education Council. It is being done in collaboration with several on-farm partners, including the Isermans in LaSalle County. And this, of course, was made possible through the help of the Illinois Farm Bureau. So thank you to IFB and NREC for their support in this work. I want to begin by providing a very big picture of phosphorus in the Midwest and what is known as the Corn Belt, and to think about how we might be able to recycle phosphorus from waste streams and use it in a form that is able to maintain crop production while decreasing phosphorus losses off of fields. So that's where the slow release nature of this fertilizer called Struvite comes in. So as a bit of background, what you are looking at here is a heat map of counties in the US that could be potentially self-sufficient in phosphorus for meeting crop needs if they, quote unquote, simply just recycle that phosphorus from waste. So by waste, we have in mind all kinds of waste streams, from human waste to livestock to things like ethanol plants. This is phosphorus that is quite literally flushed down the toilet, and it is entering from these point sources into our waterways. Not only is that a point source, it is also a potential lost opportunity to make use of a nutrient. So if you do the math, and some folks shown here have, our state in particular is really potentially self-sufficient in phosphorus. Now, this is a theoretical self-sufficiency in phosphorus if we were to recycle it from point sources. So one thing is theoretical, the other thing is how can it be done? Now, the reason why we have high theoretical potential and likely high actual potential in Illinois is we have lots of point sources, or rather P-rich waste streams. So thinking here of Chicago, lots of wastewater treatment plants, but also there's lots of grain processing plants that are not in Chicago. For example, ADM in Decatur. There's a lot of phosphorus that is embodied in grain and in human waste. If we can strip out those phosphates, we achieve a reduction in point sources while also providing a fertilizer for agricultural end users. This form of phosphorus that we have in mind is called struvite. So struvite is a German word for a mineral known as magnesium ammonium phosphate. So think of this as MAP or DAP, except you take off one of the hydrogens and you swap it out for that magnesium. Adding the magnesium makes all the difference in the water solubility. So that's why this ammonium phosphate is very different from MAP or DAP. Unlike those, it is very low water solubility, but very high citrate solubility. Since roots secrete citrate as well as other organic acids, it stands to reason that this fertilizer is what some call root activated. It'll dissolve not when there's water, but when there's water and a growing root present. So to compare struvite, a magnesium ammonium phosphate, with just the ammonium phosphate such as MAP, we can see some obvious differences. So the first one here is the solubility. As I mentioned, MAP is dominantly, just like DAP, water soluble, shown in purple. And it's the exact opposite for struvite, where it's largely insoluble in water. So if you put it out in a field and it rains, it won't dissolve. But it is largely soluble in citrate acid presence. In other words, the process of making the phosphorus in struvite becoming available is overall similar to MAP. There has to be dissolution. The difference, though, is that it happens more slowly for struvite in water, but this can be sped up when there's a root present. That's a nicely elegant mechanism to synchronize the release of the phosphorus for when the crop needs it. It'll dissolve when there's a crop root that's actively growing. Now, this has led to what our lab likes to think of as the triple win for phosphorus that can be offered by struvite. So by the triple win, I mean that there's three potential benefits. They're hypothesized, and our work as part of this NREC proposal is to test those hypotheses. So the first win of struvite is that we can reduce point source losses. Those are roughly half of all of our state's phosphorus losses to the Mississippi basin. The second win of struvite is that it might offer a more efficient fertilizer. Efficiency simply defined as it'll dissolve when the crop needs it. As the root is growing, again, those root exudates like citrate will dissolve the granule. And then the third advantage is that the low water solubility of struvite will protect it, especially when it's fall applied, from potential loss as dissolved reactive phosphorus with rainfall. So there's reason to think that we can both decrease point source losses by removing P as struvite. We get to double dip it as a fertilizer and in a form that makes it less prone to being lost. So a triple win. Obviously there's a catch, as all things in life. And that might be is that the dissolution, especially in early stage crop growth. So we're thinking, V2 to V4 corn, that the dissolution may not be able to keep pace with crop phosphorus needs. So there's this trade-off between the low solubility of struvite lets us capture it from water, we precipitate it. It also can help synchronize with growing roots, but it might be a little bit too insoluble. So our lab's work is to understand and to quantify this trade-off. And this trade-off is not an all or nothing proposition. It can be a grayish, not a black and white issue. So the way that we have proposed to navigate this trade-off is to do blends. Why not have a combination of a quick release dose of MAP or DAP mixed with a slow release component of struvite? And it stands to reason that as we increase the amount of struvite, so less MAP, we're likely to decrease the loss risk, but at the same time, we might be aggravating P deficiency in early season crop growth. So we want to find what is the optimum blend, the percent MAP, the percent struvite, that negotiates the trade-off in a way that we can have our cake and eat it too, which is maintain or even bump up yields while decreasing significantly soluble phosphorus loss risk. It is likely to be somewhere in the middle. A first step in this work that I'd like to inform you about is that we've dove into what's been published on struvite, and here's a good example of how academics sometimes might focus a little bit too much on greenhouse studies to imply field applicability of a fertilizer. So what you're looking at here on the left-hand side is a bar graph where the bigger the graph, so shown going from top to bottom here, the more number of studies on the y-axis. And on the x-axis is simply the past few years or the past few decades. What stands out here is that most work on struvite has been done pretty much after 2000. And the second observation is that it's largely in greenhouse. So this olive green color signifies greenhouse studies. Note in light aqua, the relatively low number of field trials evaluating how well can struvite meet crop phosphorus needs. We also found that being greenhouse studies, the soil types being used are largely sandier soils. So that is shown here in the red triangles for greenhouse studies, and they tend to occur in this lower corner of the soil texture triangle, which would signify that they have, about more than 60% clay. Out here in our state, we don't typically see, except maybe some floodplains, we don't see more than about 30–35% sand on the high end. So not that applicable to our context. I think this makes sense because when you're packing pots for the greenhouse, no one wants to work with a silty clay loam like what we have in central north state. They're just really tough to work with. So this would reflect a bias in the greenhouse approach. There's three other problems though. First is that so that's the first problem, that they're greenhouse studies. The second problem is that we've got, as I've mentioned, these sandier textures which don't reflect our Illinois soil types. The third issue is that the crop species that are being evaluated are not really corn. They're largely wheat and lots of rye and beans, but not soybeans. So we're thinking here of super common beans. So the soil types, the crop types, and the scale aren't really applicable to field production agriculture in Illinois. Our lab is changing that. We are, to our knowledge, the first place in the US doing field scale evaluations. I'll mention that Dr. Belo's lab is also doing some great work on this P source. So here at the U of I, we have these field trials going, and I'd like to share with you some of our last year's yield results on the takeaways of can Struvite be a P source for corn, soy, and wheat. Now, we wrote this NREC proposal just proposing one site on the South Farms. The panel proposed, it would be really nice to look at different sites, different soils, different climates. And if you looked at a different crop, so we threw in another crop, wheat, that was in a double crop wheat soybean system. And we added a few more sites. So what you're looking at here are the site locations. We've got 2 trials in Urbana, one in Streeter and one in Ditterich. You'll probably butcher me, or sorry, I butchered that, so you'll forgive me for that perhaps. And that's more central south. We like that site because it gives us a very different soil type. We're now moving into alpha soils that are more typical of the southern third of the state. The theme here, though, is that we're looking at different blends. And so we can see here that the blends of Struvite go from 0, so that would just be the control of MAP or DAP, all the way up to 75% Struvite. These ratios vary by the trial location. Especially for the on-farm trials, we went with lower rates because we want to be sure that we don't suffer any yield drags. So we went a little bit more exploratory with higher Struvite percentages for our on-campus trial sites. Now, across these 4 sites in these 8 site years, we have roughly a good handle on 1/4 of all the major soil types in Illinois. So from these 4 sites, by virtue of the homogeneity of soil types overall at the level of mollisol versus alpha sol, our results on Struvite are applicable to much of the state. So what are those results? Well, I'm going to focus here first on the Urbana corn soybean site. Here we looked at different blends going up to 75% Struvite. We looked at the timing, fall versus spring, the method of application. So for fall and spring, we looked at broadcast. And then for spring, we looked at banding. There was no fall banding. And we looked at all these different combinations in a factorial study under no-till and conventional till. Why the tillage effect? Well, if you're broadcasting and you don't till, there may not be as much incorporation of that struvite granule. That could limit its contact with soil surfaces, soil water, and as a result, we would expect lower dissolution. We are currently in the 2nd year, which is the soybean year. So I'll be showing you the corn soybean results. Sorry, the corn yield results. Now we added about just shy of 47 pounds of P2O5 per acre. That was based on the soil test, which was a little bit shy of the target of 20 to 25 ppm melic. And we also accounted for a target yield of 200 bushel corn. So we are using the build and maintain of our state's agronomy handbook for this rate. What we noted for the corn in the 2019 season was that in the most extreme condition of hypothesized limitation of crop growth, we did see some signs early on of P deficiency. So this is the worst case, meaning that we have the highest amount of Struvite. We also have a spring broadcast, and we have no-till. So because of that, we've minimized the mixing of the surface applied Struvite. And I say worst case because remember, the expectation is that if we go whole hog and we go full Struvite and no MAP or little MAP, we might have too much Struvite that would then limit crop growth. Again, we're trying to find these optimal blend ratios. Now, even though we saw visual signs of some slight P deficiency shown here by the classical purple veining of corn, this quickly cleared up by B4. And If we look at the yields, we find that there's effectively no difference in corn yields. So here showing the yields for the no-till treatments, we find that there's no statistical difference among the struvite blends on the x-axis. So as we go from just MAP to up to 75% struvite, i.e. 25% MAP, that blend did not yield any differently, statistically speaking, from just MAP. So this is good news in the sense that we can have this locally sourced P fertilizer, struvite, from waste streams without an apparent yield penalty going up to 75% struvite. We then looked at the same approach, going in this case all the way up to purely struvite, so no MAP in this extreme blend treatment on the right hand of the x-axis. And we looked at this in a wheat-soybean double crop system. I know this is a little bit unusual for central state, but with warmer winters, it's becoming a little bit more common. So first thing to note, we had pretty poor yields because we had a later planting and then we got hit by that dry spell for soybean. So with that disclaimer, we find that there's no difference in wheat or in the following soybean yields across our pure MAP to pure struvite. In other words, we can fully swap out MAP, use struvite, and there's no yield penalty as we might have potentially expected. Now, part of this might be is that we have relatively high soil test phosphorus. So the previous site that we just saw was about 19 melic phosphorus. The target is 20 to 25. In this site, we had pushing more like 35 to 45. So we had an abundance of soil test phosphorus. We're in the maintain zone, but that's not a bad thing because most of our state soils are in fact found in the build and maintain zone. So if we look at the US average on the left versus the average of soil test P and Bray equivalents, we find that our two sites were in a responsive zone for the corn, and then for the double crop wheat soybean, it was on the higher end, not excessive, but definitely in maintain. And so in other words, if you've banked up enough soil test P, it might be possible to fully swap out MAP or DAP and instead go for the magnesium ammonium version of struvite. So we don't see any extreme at the field scale yield drag that was hypothesized for a high proportion of struvite. Now we need to do some future work, which is ongoing on quantifying the water quality benefits. So far, this work is encouraging because it suggests that under real world conditions and in the soil and climate types of our state, struvite could offer a potential right source of phosphorus. As a next step, as part of this work with NREC, we're going to be quantifying just how much might we mitigate dissolved phosphorus runoff risk if we switch from struvite to MAP, from MAP to struvite, but more realistically, if we have a blend of MAP and struvite. That will be an update coming out in the coming months. So in summary, we have a high potential to recycle phosphorus in the Corn Belt, and our state has a very favorable situation because of all the point sources. So that's our triple win, that we can decrease point sources. Here, non-point sources might also experience a decrease in P losses if they're using struvite, given its low water solubility. And we can maintain crop production. Now, I kind of like this idea because it means that we're effectively transferring phosphorus from point sources into non-point sources, ag fields. In other words, agriculture is taking a leading role in helping the point sources make use of this material that would otherwise be lost from the point sources. So a very active and a novel way for agriculture to help contribute to our state's nutrient loss reduction strategy. Given our field trial data, it does seem like there's feasibility of using relatively high ratios of struvite and MAP. Relatively high meaning more than 35%, which is the current working blend ratio in industry. So with that, I'd like to end this presentation. I would be happy to field any questions. Feel free to reach out to me. My phone office is shown here, as well as my email. Specifically, our lab is looking for any interested on-farm partners to do some strip trials with Struvite. The material is provided at no cost. What you would get out of it would be free soil testing, as well as a team of graduate students and myself coming down to your site, taking some soil and foliar samples pre-plant and then at harvest. So let us know. We'd be happy to try out Struvite in your field and to help you try it out for your conditions. Thanks very much.